Good afternoon. Let us begin. My name is Prokopio. I'm a professor at law school at Ila State University. And it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you here. Thank you for coming. I'm sure you will have very interesting 1 hour and a half or a little bit more. Let me warmly welcome Professor Erik's Jensen, Director of Rule of Law Program at Stanford Law School. Professor, it's a privilege to have you with us. And on behalf of our law school, I would like to thank you for finding time and possibility to visit us and to talk about a very important topic, a topic which is important for all the countries, all the societies, but especially for those which are now in transition, and that is importance of the rule of law. Well, I forgot to mention that we have, although it was announced that the working language today is English, we have a possibility, we have a simultaneous translation, so there are earphones here, up to 30 earphones available for those who prefer to listen to the lecture in Georgian. But if you understand what I'm saying now, it means that you don't need an interpretation. So let us continue. Professor Jensen has an extensive experience of working in field of law and development. Accumulated experience for more than 30 years of working in not only in academia, but also what I think is even more important through practice, by carrying out field works in more than 35 countries, I guess, in developing countries. So Professor Jensen is someone who is a lawyer and a professional who can speak with authority on this topic, not only from academic point of view, but is also someone who who had a possibility and a chance to test these theories in practice. So many of you also probably heard about the Leadership Academy for Development program, LAD, which was co-founded by the Stanford University and John Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. And for the last 2 years, we had a privilege to have led program run here in Georgia with the support and with cooperation of Stanford University as well as Georgian NGO, Economic Policy Research Center. And I want to thank, well, specifically I want to use this occasion and thank Ms. Nina Viniza and also Professor Fukuyama, of course, for making this making this program possible in Georgia. And also thank you for helping us to organize this public lecture. So today we will talk about the rule of law, and more specifically about the evolution of legal institutions, and whether rule of law, and whether or not rule of law is necessary precondition for the development. The idea of rule of law is floating around for quite some time. The idea of the government, the society should be governed by the law, goes back to the ancient times, back to the ancient Greece or times of Aristotle, and then it was rediscovered in Middle Ages as well by Thomas Aquinas and others. And again, it was discovered by our societies, which found ourselves again in a very important stage of transformation. So without further ado, I want to hand the floor to Professor Jensen. I will lean back and enjoy the session together with you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Vardzlavishi. It's really an honor to be back at Ila State University. Frank Fukuyama, my dear friend, and I were here several years ago and gave a public lecture, which I didn't prepare for. So I prepared for this public lecture. We'll see which is better. Frank Fukuyama said maybe you shouldn't prepare lectures anymore. It sort of worked out extemporaneously. But I'm really delighted to be back. I want to thank Nino Evgenitsa for being Saint Nino to both me and my family on this trip. And I was happy to visit the Cathedral of Saint Nino on this visit as well. So I'll never forget her sainthood as Executive Director of the Economic Policy Research Center. Georgia is quite a special place that seems to be recognized as such by many, including the Draper Hill Summer Fellows Program at Stanford. I took a look at our alums from Georgia. The program at Stanford started 11 years ago, and I was one of the founding faculty. And Georgia, despite being what we might call internationally a small country of 5 million or less people, seems to have had a summer fellow, one summer fellow every year since 2006. Some of us on the selection committee say, this is very odd to have a small country punching above its weight, but of course as you get to know Georgia, it's always punching above its weight. At any rate, I'm going to talk today about middle-income countries and the tenuous transition from weak rule of law to strong rule of law. I have to admit that I've had to alter some of my comments. I have made a career of being provocative, and some years ago, in the early 2000s, I did a 10-country study on judicial independence of 10 countries across Asia, and I concluded that none of them had very strong judicial independence, and some of them were doing extraordinarily well economically. So as the professor here said, I walk the earth and I look and I say, well, there's doctrine and then there's practice. And it made me think that maybe judicial independence is not that important at all times. I'll get around to Georgia later in my remarks, but I wanted to give you some context for some of my provocation. So as Professor Fukuyama always says, you lawyers, you don't have a strong theory of transition from weak rule of law to strong rule of law. Now, despite many academics and a lot of rule of law experts, there is no blueprint for achieving strong rule of law. There have been many paths to that. When you look at OECD countries, you say, well, they've all got pretty strong legal institutions. Italy ranks a bit below Georgia, actually, but we don't know exactly how they got there. What is the relationship between the economy and other demands within society and the development of legal institutions? So our theory of transitions from weak to strong rule of law is underdeveloped, but I would argue that we know more than Dr. Seuss does about transitions to strong rule of law. I don't know how many of you know Dr. Seuss, but he's a famous children's book writer in the US who said, you know, first this thing happens, then that thing happens, and then the other thing happens, and it will probably never happen that way again. So that's the Dr. Seuss rule on randomness. I would suggest we know a bit more than Dr. Seuss about transitions from weak to strong rule of law. And we know enough about rule of law interventions to not do stupid stuff. As former President Obama said about foreign policy, you know, the first rule is don't do stupid stuff. I turned this into a PG version of what he actually said, but it was something to that effect. Some of the theorists that I paid attention to in my career are this very dour-looking German who is not smiling by the name of Max Weber, who is a very famous legal sociologist who died at the age of 56 in the early 1900s after writing a stack of books like this. And he wrote very perceptively about law and economy and how societies evolve. He took a very interdisciplinary approach. The other guy, a very smiling guy, Nobel laureate who unfortunately died last year, Doug North, who spent many years at Stanford in his career. That's one of the reasons why he is smiling, I would argue. We all smile at Stanford. The weather forces us to do so. So before getting into too much of a discussion, I think it's important to define what are middle-income countries. They have a gross national income per capita of between $1,026 and $12,475, and there are 52 lower middle-income countries, and there are 56 upper middle-income countries in the world. Most of the countries are in Asia and Latin America are middle-income countries. Many countries in Central and Eastern Europe, as you know very well, are, and some middle-income countries in Africa in recent years, but most in Africa are lower-income countries. Now I'm going to come back to this slide later on, but I sat back in my chair one day, as I frequently do, and thought, what are some successful programs that I know of at a national level that have been successful? And here are a few of those programs. Singapore in 1991-92, it was an upper middle income country, but it decided it wanted more. And it reformed its judiciary to become one of the best functioning, most efficient judiciaries in the world. South Korea, Hungary, Poland, Chile, these are programs that were considered national success stories. Indonesia, there are question marks around. I'll return to the Indonesia case. And we have Georgia. Now, some of these countries, all of these countries were between $8,000 and $28,000 GDP per capita, PPP, at the time that they reformed, except Costa Rica for very interesting reasons at a lower level of GDP. Now, on the category to the right, you see the World Justice Project Rule of Law Index. I frankly think there are far too many indexes about a lot of things in the world that I don't think are necessarily the best social science. But I think the World Justice Project Index is one of the better, more complex indexes that's been constructed. And it's constructed by the World Justice Program, which is funded by Bill Newcomb, and I sit in the Newcomb building at Stanford Law School. That's not the reason why I think it's one of the better indexes in the world. Georgia, you see, is rated 34. Italy is rated 35 in this index. So Georgia is indeed in a special place. Now, one of the things we know just in a journalistic view of Hungary is that progress on rule of law is not inevitable, and there can be backsliding. And many of us thought that Hungary had made a fairly complete transition until recent years, and it's very clear that there's backsliding in Hungary, and what many would regard as a serious deterioration in rule of law. Some have urged the nuclear option on Hungary as well, Article 7, to suspend Hungary's voting rights. Of course, others in the club are likely to veto such a move. So these are the 6 questions that I want to address. The first 2 questions, oh my goodness, the numbering here, forgive my numbering. This was hastily put together this afternoon. The first 2 questions are really laying a foundation for a discussion. What is rule of law, and what goods is rule of law expected to deliver? Then the third question, numbered here is 2, is when do countries transition from weak rule of law to strong rule of law? I'm not going to spend as much time on this question as I originally anticipated, and I'll tell you why later. Then the 4th question, why is transition from middle-income countries to high-income countries so tenuous? It's indeed very difficult to make that transition. And we see that looking at data around the world. And then fifth, what are some of the conditions conducive to developing stronger institutional autonomy? And sixth, where does Georgia want to go from here on rule of law? And how does rule of law interact with other larger aspirations that Georgia has? So now we're back to the correct numbering, and I hope it's correct numbering throughout the lecture, but I can't guarantee that. Larry Summers blew into Jakarta in 1998, according to the Jakarta Post, and then proclaimed after a day of walking around and talking to people in Jakarta, he lumbered up the steps of his plane, he looked out over the unwashed, and he said, "Indonesia needs the rule of law." Now, there are politicians who do this around the world, announcing that X country needs the rule of law. So it begs the question, what did Larry Summers mean by Indonesia needs the rule of law, and what goods do we expect the rule of law to deliver? So here's a definition of formal legality. This was developed by Lon Fuller in a Texas Law Review article back in the 1960s, but it comports with a lot of rule of law scholars around the world on what they would regard as formal rule of law. First, the laws are publicly available, that they're general in scope, they aren't passed with the intention of being enforced against one person, that is. They're prospective, that they're known in advance and certain in application. They're applied equally, which I think is a central challenge of rule of law. And institutions enforce the legal rules. And then democratic formal legality emphasizes attempts to maximize the consent of the governed to the laws. Now, Hans Kelsen defined rule of law as a normative system backed by the threat of physical force. Hans Kelsen was the grandfather of the constitutional court model around the world, an Austrian back in the 1920s. He later went to, I say he went to Berkeley to die, but that's not what he did. He happened to be at Berkeley after a long and distinguished career, and he did die while he was teaching at Berkeley. Another formulation of the rule of law is that it's a stage where laws are widely known, clear in meaning, and applied equally. Is there a problem with this? I mean, many laws that I've reviewed and advocated on behalf and for and tried to understand are anything but clear in meaning. Certainly they're not widely known by the general population. Many of the technical laws that I learned to develop certain expertise in complex securities litigation and the like, the general public knows nothing about these laws. And applied equally, I think, is always a problem across countries, and we see this from high-income countries to middle-income countries to low-income countries. The equal application of law is unbelievably difficult. Now, Max Weber, somewhat in accord with Hans Kelsen's definition, he defined legal coercion. He said it's the coercive action of the state based on law. Now, there is a definitional debate. Some rule of law scholars advocate a thin definition of rule of law, where government officials and citizens are bound by and abide by the law. They're bound by the law, they abide by the law. That's it. Others advocate a much thicker definition of rule of law that is consistent with international human rights norms and standards and participation in decision-making and the like. The UN and others advocate this. The modern era with its data search tools can be a wonderful thing. And I just did a quick data search on the Georgian Constitution, and I found international was mentioned 28 times. Human rights, 10 times. Universal, which usually precedes human rights, 14 times, and rights, 37 times. So it's quite clear to me that Georgia, if its constitution is a reflection of the aspirations of the people, it aspires to a thicker definition of rule of law. Now, returning to this problem of equal protection, I gave a talk it says something about my life. 2 weeks ago I was in Afghanistan, a month ago I was in Kurdistan. But when I was in Afghanistan 2 weeks ago, I was asked to give a public lecture, and I thought as I got on a plane, what is the most important rule of law provision that I know of in American law? And in fact, it's not even found in the Constitution. It is found in the 14th Amendment to the Constitution that was about 80 years after the Constitution came into effect. And it's this idea that everyone is equal under the law, no matter who you are, no matter how powerful you are, no matter what your economic status is, no matter what your social status is, that you are equal before the law. And then you see Georgia actually did include equal protection in its constitution, not by amendment many years later, that everyone is born free and equal before the law. So I want to emphasize that rule of law is not like pregnancy. You don't either have it or not have it. There are many gradations in between. So I have many friends who are China legal scholars focused on China, one of whom argued with me, look, Eric, China cannot have the rule of law until the one-party communist system breaks down. And I said, really, that's preposterous. It's a country of 1.2 or 3 billion people now. It's quite orderly. Certainly there are things working in the rule of law in China, and certainly there are. I had a China law scholar do some research for me on court cases in China, and the court cases that were working well, small debt, small property, family cases and the like, cases where the state didn't have an acute interest, a political interest, those cases were proceeding quite well. In Georgia, there has been a debate about judicial independence and the like, but I would suspect that cases throughout the period of the last 10 years, family cases, small debt, small property cases, have been handled reasonably well within the system. In Singapore, Singapore has rule of law with a couple of serious exceptions on the right to association, on political parties and the like, and the right to free speech. Certainly the media is constrained in ways. But Singapore has many dimensions of rule of law that are actually quite robust. Anyway, rule of law is not like pregnancy. And as far as I know, in pregnancy you either have it or don't have it. And I'm trying to be gender sensitive here. I've never been pregnant, but this is what I imagine. Okay, so what goods does rule of law deliver, or does it purport to deliver? And I'd ask you all, what do you expect from rule of law? There's no wrong answer to this. Say anything. Some of the summer fellows from previous programs could say many things about this, but I'll ask them to refrain from doing so.
Justice.
Justice, okay. Anyone else? Justice implies, again, equal treatment before the law. It also might imply protection of human rights, huh? I'm just trying to read your mind.
Equality.
Equality.
Order.
Order, definitely. You're doing very well, keep going. Any other ideas? No, that's a good sampling.
Freedom.
Sort of freedom?
Yes.
Okay, good. So according to political scientists, what they're really talking about, and I argue with my political science friends Frank Fukuyama and Larry Diamond all the time about rule of law. Political scientists are really focused on rule of law to constrain the exercise of power by political actors. That is an important idea. I don't deny that. I just think there are other things to rule of law as well. Economists focus on rule of law to guarantee property rights and enforce contracts. So what I heard from you, order was definitely on the list. Stability is definitely associated with goods that rule of law is expected to deliver. Citizen and national security accordingly under the order category. Dispute resolution, economic growth and development, human rights protection, protection from government caprice and corruption. We don't know a lot about the causal connections, or nearly as much about the causal connections as some theorists and promoters of rule of law would suggest. So when do countries transition from weak to strong rule of law? This is something about which I'm spending a lot of time in my own research agenda at Stanford right now. This is the assertion by Doug North. His general assertion is that legal institutions and judicial enforcement are necessary to transition from a traditional economy to a developed economy. That's his basic argument. Now, I have a lot of respect for Doug North. He's one of the most influential economists in my life. But I don't agree with this. Likewise, Hernando de Soto claims that development is possible only if efficient legal institutions are available to all citizens. Now the biggest problem with these assertions by Doug North and Hernando de Soto are just looking at the three biggest success stories since World War II. Three biggest success stories, none of which were marked by well-developed legal institutions. India is consistently rated as one of the worst in contract enforcement, and property rights are a real problem in India as well. China, long-term growth, long-term amazing growth. It's responsible over the last 30 years for 80% of poverty reduction worldwide. And its legal institutions at the start of its reform process back in the 1970s, its judiciary was pretty much run by retirees from the military who had absolutely no judicial training whatsoever. The East Asian miracle countries, Japan, Singapore, the East Asian tigers, Taiwan, paid no attention to legal institutions. Now I'm cheating, and I admit that I'm cheating, but if you're just looking at legal institutions narrowly defined as judiciaries, none of these three major success stories rank. China has a very interesting set of organizational principles that, with a national policy that's rigorously pursuing economic growth. And they've done things that I never thought they could do. The East Asian tiger countries had strong bureaucracies that performed extremely well with an extraordinary national development vision. India somehow works, this is a more complex story, but there are many substitutes for well-functioning judiciary, including arbitration institutions. So, Paul Brest, the former dean of Stanford Law School, and I are leading a research project at Stanford where we are challenging neoclassical economic theory that a well-functioning judiciary is needed for economic growth, and that law is necessarily better and more cost-effective than other ways of organizing to achieve economic growth. The substitutes for formal legal processes, some of them are familiar to you. Relationships. Neoclassical economists say we live in an impersonal environment. All of the countries I've worked in, personal relationships have been extraordinarily important. Personal relationships are extraordinarily important in the Silicon Valley, where I go to various meetings and social gatherings and the like with tech entrepreneurs and others who are talking all the time, developing relationships figuring out whether they can trust each other in high-risk ventures. So relationships are a part of the world. Some economists would like to say, no, the height of development is a bunch of impersonal relationships. I would say personal relationships are everywhere, including the most developed parts of the world. And another substitute for a well-functioning legal system is a country that is vigorously growth-oriented. Government is committed to national development. This happens more rarely than we'd like to admit. Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore may have benefited some personally in developing Singapore, but he was committed from the very start to extraordinary national development, economic development, and they achieved that. There are many stories that political scientists will say and talk about endlessly about leaders plundering the state. And many leaders have plundered many, many states. That's the usual arc of development. But a strong national program of economic growth can substitute for well-functioning legal institutions. So we come to this point of, do property rights and enforcement of contracts cause economic growth? Or does economic growth lead to the need for greater respect for property rights and contracts and better performance of legal institutions? And where is that tipping point when demand for law and legal institutions becomes more pervasive? I'm going to come back to, time and again over the next 10 minutes, the importance of demand for legal institutions. Because this doesn't happen in a vacuum. Legal institutions don't develop apart from political and economic forces that are pressuring legal institutions to develop. And people as different, political philosophers as different as Adam Smith and Karl Marx realized the importance of demand for law and legal institutions. My working hypothesis is that there are on-again and off-again connections between law and legal institutions and economic growth and development. Very good. And the reasons for these on-again, off-again connections are at least threefold. There's growing evidence about desirable institutions have a lot to do with context specificity. And over my last 3 days here in Georgia, I've been impressed by the context specificity within which Georgia acts. Workarounds to the legal system are everywhere. You've got clans, you've got guilds, you've got personal relationships substituting for legal guarantees, and you've got a developmental state, among others. And then there's common business practice. Decades ago, I started my legal career with a now Fortune 1 company. No, it's a Fortune 2 company now that some of the tech companies are coming in. Doing risk analysis and trying to understand where the legal system fit in the risk of doing business in countries. Now, foreign direct investment can go anywhere, and Georgia is enjoying some of the push on foreign direct investment, especially since the association agreement of 2014. But there are different types of risk that foreign direct investment looks at. The commercial risk of fluctuating markets, the political risk of expropriation, the legal risk of unpredictable courts, the regulatory risk of administrative action, the security risk, crime, and social risk. What do I mean by social risk? I use the example of the pharmaceutical industry in South Africa when HIV/AIDS retrovirals were being priced very high. And civil society rose up and said, you've got to make these HIV/AIDS drugs affordable to those who are affected. So civil society pressured pharmaceutical companies to reduce their price on drugs, and they succeeded. So what comes first? Again, order, stability, and economic growth are at the foundation, but then we get into Karl Marx and Adam Smith and the demand for law and legal institutions increasing as economies grow. So why are transitions from middle-income countries to high-income countries so difficult? In 1960, there were 101 middle-income countries. By 2015, only 19 of these countries had transitioned to high-income countries. This is the game that Georgia is playing now. Western Europe, Spain, Greece, Portugal, Ireland, they transitioned. Hungary, Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovenia, Slovak Republic, they transitioned a little bit in the Middle East. We have some examples, some strong examples from Asia. Not much in Africa, there for certain reasons, not a lot in Latin America. The outlier countries are oil-rich countries of the Middle East that are now high-income countries, and tourist financial services, tax haven countries. We've all read about the Panama Papers and the like. There are tax shelters that have achieved high income. So a couple of dear friends of mine, Tom Ginsberg and Randy, Tom is the Vice Dean of University of Chicago Law School. Randy is associated with several institutions, Oxford and others now. They said at some point in the process of economic development, high-income countries experience the political incentives to build autonomous courts with a significant degree of autonomy, particularly in areas that allow the regime to make credible commitments in the economic sphere. I would argue that Georgia is so placed, and with Georgia's aspirations, it's not just in the economic sphere that Georgia has strong incentives to build autonomous courts. So independent, autonomous, third-party monitoring becomes an important function, but when and how? So my message to you in Georgia is to remember Malaysia. Malaysia for years has been stuck in what we call a middle-income trap. In 1988, the Prime Minister fired the Lord President of the Supreme Court after the court asserted constitutional supremacy. The Constitution was amended to remove references to judicial power. Then the courts were used to punish enemies of the Prime Minister. Then intermediate middle-income countries with middling institutions, middling quality of democracy can remain stuck as middle-income countries. I think this is a cautionary tale because the odds of moving from a middle-income country to a high-income country are not great. So Georgia needs to do whatever it can to make that leap. So I'm going to compare the role of the state in Malaysia to Singapore. The role of the state, Malaysia used industrial policy to protect vested interests. Singapore used industrial policy to achieve national development. Absent a developmental state vigorously directing growth or an extraordinary size of market, institutional autonomy can really matter. I've been nibbling around the edges, I've been provoking for a long time, and Georgia and Georgia's experience have forced me to revise some of my provocation here. So I return again to successful national programs. Georgia is at the precipice of a tipping point. It's very close in GDP per capita, PPP. Its institutional strength is at a point where you can say, well, we can be complacent and carry on and do quite well, do better than Italy in some ways, or we can do more. So what are some of the conditions conducive to developing stronger institutional autonomy? When and under what conditions do workarounds to the legal system become less desirable, inducing economic actors and others to press for reform of legal institutions? I'm not going to go through this list, but I'm going to highlight a couple of things. The interests of actors really matter. The leadership, elite commitment, the neighborhood matters, and this is so striking in Georgia. Interest groups and coalitions matter. The fact is that collective action to reform public institutions globally is usually weak because the costs are high and the relative returns tend to be low. People tend not to go out into the streets to reform institutions at a scalable level. And that's why I'm always looking to where demand is for improvement of institutions. Which institutions constrain power? The judiciary, there's a famous book called The Least Dangerous Branch about the US judiciary. But I must say the US judiciary in ways has made me very proud in recent years with the independence that they've exercised. Counter-corruption commissions usually fail around the world. When they don't fail, there's usually a precipitating event where people are taking to the streets. Georgia's already been through one of these periods of precipitating events that energized a first generation of reform. There's international support tied to the public demand for reform. There's strong leadership, and at least the leadership at certain stages acknowledges the importance of reform. There's public mobilization, civil society groups. I won't get into any more of that. It's one of my favorite case studies in trying to figure out where does institutional autonomy come from. So where does Georgia want to go from here? And this is, I'm just going to lay out a couple of ideas and I'll look forward to the discussion. Georgia has been a poster child of first-generation reforms. Starting with electricity and making electricity available. Years ago, I was very involved in all sorts of policy work at a national level across developing countries, and people would ask me, where should we start? I said, I'd start with keeping the lights on. Get electricity going, which is a brilliant first idea because it touches everyone. Then there was police reform, amazing reform of public services. These are case studies that we have at Stanford. One thing that I'm doing now with someone who works for me is looking at the case study of judicial reform in Georgia. And we have a lot to learn about that case study. But there has been some lag time in some of the reforms of the judiciary and the prosecutor's office. I've scanned a lot of consultant reports. I don't come here with a deep knowledge, as our moderator does, of the workings within the judiciary. And again, Karl Marx and Adam Smith, where is demand for change going to come from for the next generation of reforms in Georgia? Here are what I see as some general demand factors. An unbelievable sense of national identity. I was just at your National Museum this morning. I was overwhelmed, actually just overwhelmed, but with the sense of national identity in Georgia. Many countries I work in have no sense of statehood, which is just the geographical territory, much less nationhood, a collective sense of nationhood. That's a national asset of unbelievable value. External threats to territorial integrity present some rather existential reasons for demand in Georgia. Overwhelming public support for joining the EU is also suggestive of, well, what are the demands of the EU? If we want to become members of that club, can we sit in this middle-income territory, ranked 34th in the world, which is not bad in rule of law, or do we need to do more? Likewise, a strong support for joining NATO. I usually look for strong and competing economic actors. I don't know enough about the structure of the Georgian economy to make comments on it, but that's something I usually look for as a general demand factor. Specific demand factors, of course, are some very specific things that you have committed to in the association agreement. The thing about the association agreement is that it could be on pace for maybe the pace of Georgia will be 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. That's all within Georgia's field of control to ascertain when what is our sense of urgency in moving toward some of these commitments? And there certainly has been demonstrated in the past domestic political consequences. Former Prime Minister of Georgia was at Stanford, not in April 2012. Again, I hastily put this together. This is not April 2012. This is April 2017. Your former Prime Minister was at Stanford, and he said, one of the reasons we lost the election in 2012 was for failing to reform the judiciary. Now, are the stakes in judicial reform that high domestically still? Or was it then, and is there a sense of complacency now? Or has Georgia moved along in reform of the judiciary at a sufficient pace? The public is happy, the EU is happy. I raise these questions for you to answer in the discussion. Now, China had peculiar circumstances, and Singapore had peculiar circumstances. China has significant challenges to judicial independence, but it's grown at an amazing rate. Singapore has been very targeted about the areas where it isn't judicially independent, and it's grown at a fantastic rate. But does Georgia have different factors coming in, the general demand factors and the specific demand factors that Georgia's working on? And can Georgia achieve its aspirations without achieving internationally recognized, robust judicial independence? That's the question I leave you with. You may have thought that's the question that was going to be answered for you in the lecture, but that's the question I leave you with. Thank you very much.
We spoke about different countries, different models like Singapore, Georgia, China. And we also spoke about different factors which are necessary for the development. One of those is stability. Singapore and China, those show that they are quite stable at this stage, at least, and so they were stable throughout the years. Political transition, or well, there was no change in political leadership I mean, there was change in leadership in China. It changes, but not the party itself.
And the party doesn't change in Singapore either.
And the party doesn't change in Singapore, and the leader was there for quite a long time. The stability is there, but there are still big differences between China and Singapore in terms of judicial independence index, which you mentioned. Singapore ranks quite well. It's at the top 10. China is way below. The corruption index, the perception of corruption in Singapore is almost zero. I mean, it's again the first or the second country, I think, and China is not like that. So what is really a difference between what makes those countries develop so rapidly, still being so different, and the corruption and the judicial dependence in both are very important for the development. So the stability is only one which kind of one can find in common for those countries, or there is something else. What would you respond to those in Georgia or somewhere else who would say that, well, we're happy with the ranking we have now with the judicial independence. Let's keep that way, and maybe eventually we will achieve high growth rates and end up where Singapore is now, let's say.
And I say, maybe you're satisfied with potentially becoming stuck in the middle income trap. The high income economies always they have achieved through this dynamic of demand for better institutional performance. They've achieved high levels of performance institutionally. And even in China, while China is very different from Singapore, if you look at Shanghai, the institutions that are at work, the legal institutions in Shanghai, work brilliantly well. Shanghai is like an enclave of a highly developed income country. So we see that, you know, we see that eventually there is some convergence. Now, Professor Fukuyama and I are very interested, and we're engaged in a research project wondering about whether China is really going to develop a separate pathway to a high-income country. I don't know. By the time China becomes a high-income country, I'm no longer going to be alive. We're talking 15 years or so, 15 or 20 years. There have been many predictions about the Chinese economy collapsing for the last 2 decades. It hasn't happened. Counting China out and its ability to nimbly adapt, even within its one-party system, to the demands of the marketplace should not be counted out. But Georgia comes from a completely different institutional environment. Institutional traditions, aspirations of the country. And this is where I've had to sort of face myself in an existential way, coming to Georgia and saying, well, we can do this in a number of ways. Georgia has certain aspirations that are very clearly delineated with the interest in joining the EU. With the existential threats that Georgia has to face all the time, from external threats to the country, to the country's very existence. So I don't see a pathway for Georgia to achieve high income, if that's what it wishes to do, without, you know, a serious, deep engagement that it's already involved in with the EU and some of the EU expectations of where Georgia might go as well. So this transition to high income is hard, and it's going to require some. You've already been through an amazing phase of first-generation reforms that most countries do not go through and do not succeed at. No one succeeds at police reform. Public service reform, my goodness, that is, there is a graveyard full of public service reform projects out there. There's a graveyard full of police reform projects out there. And then it becomes a question, what are the institutions that need to be reformed to really achieve a high-income country level? Or are we comfortable with the potential middle-income trap? Georgia hasn't been there long enough to call it a trap yet. A trap was proclaimed on Malaysia after 10 years of total stagnation in a region where they should have been growing at a much faster rate. Thank you.
So then my next question, I don't want to talk about the floor, so if anybody wants to, if anybody has a question, so please don't hesitate. Yes, please. And please introduce yourself as well.
Hello, my name is Tenga Sultanishvili. I have a question to you. So you said that rule of law is like virginity, or not virginity, like pregnancy.
It's not like pregnancy. Yeah.
Like it's not like pregnancy, yes. So you don't either have it or not. So to some extent, each and every country has rule of law. And I have a question to you that's kind of provocative too. So, for example, like some countries, like including United States, claim that they are protecting universal values and promoting rule of law around the world. And on the other hand, they are trading with the countries with the worst records of the rule of law. For that reason, United States and also some European countries are accused of hypocrisy. So do you think that it's hypocrisy? And if not, what do you think? What is the most prominent component of the rule of law?
I think I missed something on the hypocrisy. You gave an illustration of the hypocrisy. I'm not denying that there's hypocrisy, of course, but you gave an example that I want to make sure I understood.
Okay, I'll tell the example. So, for example, United States and European Union also is often accused for hypocrisy, for playing for double standards. On the one hand, they are claiming that they praise the human rights around the world, and on the other hand, they are trading with the countries with the worst records of protecting human rights. So, for example, the European Union has a social clause in their agreements with the countries like China or African countries, and however, the United States doesn't really have it. So it still trades with the countries with the worst record of rule of law, while also claim that protects the human rights. So do you think that it's a problem, or you think that human rights is not the most prominent component of the rule of law?
You know, this is something that I have. Can you hear me? If not, I've got strong vocal cords. The question that you ask at one level is something that I've struggled with my entire career. And that is, foreign policy has a lot of factors that go into it. And it does not lend itself to the consistency that we would like to see. Sometimes human rights is emphasized, sometimes other factors are emphasized, sometimes arms deals are done with countries that have very poor human rights records. It goes on and on, the list of inconsistencies. And I think that, you know, we're living in a political period globally where there are serious questions to be asked about how much do we really care about human rights. And I think that I'm concerned about you know, where we are when we look at political success around the world, and how little of that political success is really based on a platform of stronger human rights. I think we've got some things to be concerned about, whether it's the U.S. or Europe, or you know, other countries, and that inconsistency is something that I've observed for my entire professional career. And I wish there was a right answer to it. Those inconsistencies will last, but let's not forget about the importance of human rights. And that's something to be done across countries on leaders who are elected, who clearly care less about human rights, and sometimes leaders are elected who clearly do care about human rights, but I think we've all got a responsibility for trying to elect the right people. And I don't mean to sidestep this issue of hypocrisy. I think it's there since the times of Grotius and others, inconsistencies in policies and how nations pursue their interests.
Thank you.
Professor, thank you for the lecture. I have a question about your examples about India and China and Georgia. Do you think that different countries can afford different things? India and China, with their large markets, maybe can afford not to have a good rule of law, because investors would want to go to these big markets anyway. Russia, because of its natural resources, maybe can afford not to have a rule of law. And small countries like Georgia, they have to decide what they can offer to others. And there are things that we cannot afford. I don't think Georgia cannot afford not to have a rule of law. What do you think about this perspective?
So, even though I have a grammatical error in my final question here, the apostrophe before the S in it, that was written 2 seconds before I sent the PowerPoint off to be transferred here. I don't think Georgia can afford some of the things that many other countries can afford, given its position, its geopolitical position in the world, given the internationally unbelievably competitive economic market, where foreign direct investment can go anywhere. I don't think that Georgia can afford, you know, and given its size as well, as you point out, an alum of the Draper Hill Summer Fellows Program, Georgia can't afford the things that other countries have been able to do in substituting for really strong, robust legal institutions. And you look at the Constitution of Georgia itself. How many times is international mentioned? How many times? You're part of a neighborhood, and you want to become a stronger part of that neighborhood. And that neighborhood has expectations of you on the strength of the judiciary, human rights record, certain things about economic predictability and judicial independence in deciding all cases, whether they're economic or human rights and the like. I came to the conclusion that Georgia cannot afford the slack of China or the slack of India. It could have proceeded, if it had a different history, on a Singaporean model. But that history, you can't retrace that history. You can't go back to sort of pre-Soviet times and say, you know, if we could grab this and keep it as it was, we could have done better. Georgia could have done better, but you can't go back. So in answering the question that I just left rhetorically here, I don't think that Georgia can achieve its aspirations, unless, you know, sticking in a middle income trap is where you want to be. That's what would be predicted for you without a sense of urgency about continuing the reform process that was started so vigorously years ago.
Hi, my name is Alexander Stevens. I work on rule of law and international development, particularly on measurement and evaluation. And as you know, around the world, you know, there are new challenges to rule of law, closing civic space, increased violent extremism and other types of violence. But one thing that the world has kind of come around or converged about is the Sustainable Development Goals. And now we see the SDG 16, which is about peaceful and just societies, access to justice, rule of law, the aspirational new goal of Goal 16, which is universal, and all these countries, despite their stage of rule of law, have kind of signed onto. What would you say could be the role, in light of the challenges that all these different countries are facing, of the UN development goals to help the different countries that are aspiring to improve the rule of law? How can we use them to build on?
So now I'm going to be provocative, and I appreciate the work that you are involved in. I don't know a single success story at a national level that's been motivated by the Sustainable Development Goals, the Millennium Goals, any of this. I think you've got things much closer to home than the Sustainable Development Goals in Georgia that motivate and sort of demand a continued institutional reform. I think the Sustainable Development Goals are out there in the ether sphere, and if I could be provocative, many people around the world get together and talk about these Sustainable Development Goals, and repeatedly talk about them in different nice international conferences at nice international hotels and the like. But with Georgia, it's sort of like there are so many more immediate, important imperatives closer to home that really press the reform agenda. Maybe they'll be part of the residue of the Sustainable Development Goals. Maybe we'll see some improvements in rule of law, but I must say I'm a skeptic, and that's consistent with my unfortunately long 32-year career in the rule of law industry. You know, I wish it was so that the Sustainable Development Goals could have a more immediate impact. I think there are countries at risk where, at serious risk of violence and complete collapse into total disorganization, where some of this Sustainable Development Goal aspiration might have some effect on the channeling of international resources to places that are really in need of support. So I started out very, very critical of sustainable development goals. And then I thought of some countries, including some that I where, you know, I get into an armored SUV with a very well-trained wingman, and I don't travel without that in some of the countries that I go to. So those countries that are really at risk, I hope that there's some uptick from the Sustainable Development Goals. But I see in Georgia, there are many other things that Georgians should be paying attention to as really immediate incentives to improve.
Any other questions? Okay. Well, maybe you would like to add something?
No, people who know me know that I can talk or not talk. But I can go on for, I can threaten to punish you for 3 hours on about 3 different lectures that I'm about to give to you as an incentive for you to ask one last question. Think of one last question and then we'll end.
What are good examples of second stage reform countries?
You know, most of the countries I work in haven't been through the first stage of reform. I think that, you know, I know it's far from home, but Singapore actually did not reform its judiciary until quite late. It was a middle-income country, and I don't want to draw too many crass comparisons to countries, but 1991-92, Singapore was doing well, but it aspired to be a high-income country. Being a middle-income country wasn't good enough for Singapore. Being sort of a lower high-income country wasn't good enough for Singapore. It was going to achieve something more. And when, again, going to the National Museum today, knowing what I do about Georgia and its aspirations, there's no reason why there should be sort of contentment with this sort of middle-income level. Singapore developed an incredible national identity. Georgia has that incredible asset. Build on it. That's what I would say. Build on it. Most countries don't have, most developing countries that I work in, don't have that extraordinary sense of national identity. And Singapore, and this is where there is a comparison with Singapore, strong sense of national identity. Build on this rare asset to do the second stage. Singapore's reform agenda was unfinished when it decided none of this is good enough for us. We're going to reform the judiciary too. The judiciary lagged behind the reform of other institutions in Singapore as well, and Singapore simply decided it's not good enough. And I think there's abundant factual basis for support of the same assertion in Georgia. Being a middle-income country isn't good enough for you.
Thank you very much. Well, it's very inspiring. I think we're approaching the end of our meeting. If there are no other questions, I will try gradually to wrap up, to sum up. The very good examples you gave, Professor, just demonstrate it, especially with regard to the Singapore, at least what the conclusion I could draw in the long-term commitment to reform, to the judicial reform, to improving rule of law. That's what gives fruits eventually. And I think the question was which one, what is a second wave, the best example, and I think that we can be one of those. I hope. So let me invite you to come over here in 15 or 10 years as well. So we engage in a discussion and then compare the developments of Georgia, Singapore, China, and many other countries.
Professor, I hope we can do a retrospective on the success story of Georgia in the second generation of reforms.
Well, I certainly hope that would be possible. And that's indeed, I mean, if we recall again what you referred to others, and I think it was Paul Mikram as well, they spoke about the need for a good reputation for a traders in order to trade. So, and one has to know the reputation of a trader, how the trader behaved in the past in order to engage in a transaction. And when the communities become larger, and especially in the international market now, you need to have something else. I mean, then the judicial system seems to be with a good reputation. The judicial system with a good reputation seems to be a kind of a bond which attracts foreign investors, so they can trust this place without really investing much into the research and to finding out the background of the counterparts over there. So long-term commitment, which made Singapore successful in a way, built a reputation of a reliable partner, and we are somewhere in the middle way, I guess, on the way to get together to the place where probably all of us wants to get, to the place of the developed country with not only the high income but with a place where each of us would love to live and to grow up children. So a place which is comfortable in all sense, not only materially but also from the point of view of a comfortable way of life, I mean from the point of view of human development. So let me thank you very much, and let me have again, if you want,